The winter afternoon hung low over the camp, turning everything the color of old iron. Snow had stopped falling hours ago, but its silence stayed behind, filling the gaps between barbed wire coils and watchtower shadows. Inside the workshop, the air carried a different stillness, one shaped by rust, damp wood, and the quiet fear of men who knew their worth only through what their hands could fix. Thomas Weaver sat alone at a scarred wooden table, rubbing the numbness from his fingers. Months of captivity had worn him thin, but not empty. His mind still ticked with the stubborn rhythm of a man who once built radios for merchant ships crossing the North Atlantic. Back then, signals had meant safety, connection, a lifeline to a world beyond the fog. Now, behind enemy wire, they were reminders of everything he no longer had. Boots approached, slow, heavy, unbothered by the cold. 2 German guards pushed open the door, letting in a slice of gray light and the sharp bite of air. Without a word, they set a broken communications unit on the bench in front of him. It landed with a dull metallic thud, as if announcing its own defeat. Thomas didn't look up. He knew the guards' faces by heart, carved by war, stiff with obedience. They expected him to fear them, and part of him did, but fear didn't fix radios. Hands did, knowledge did. So he studied the shattered casing, the frayed wires spilling out like veins from a wounded animal. One guard muttered something about bombers and interference, pointing at the exposed tubes. Another tapped his rifle against his leg, impatient. Their message was clear: repair the machine, or trouble follows. In this camp, consequences always arrived quickly and without echo. Yet, as Thomas leaned in, adjusting the lamp to examine the damage, a strange quiet settled inside him. The world outside operated on threat and suspicion, but the small universe inside the metal box obeyed a different logic, one he understood intimately. Resistors didn't care about flags, currents didn't salute, circuits carried no hatred. To him, the radio wasn't an enemy device, it was a wounded puzzle asking for help. This was the first contrast of the day. Soldiers saw a tool of war. Thomas saw a craft he could still claim as his own. He picked up a screwdriver, its handle worn from thousands of turns before the war had stolen his tools and his future. As he loosened the screws, he felt the guards watching, waiting for either a mistake or a miracle. The workshop felt smaller with them there, the walls pulling inward as though the building itself feared their presence. But the deeper Thomas looked into the machine's broken heart, the more the outside world faded. Wires replaced boundaries, static replaced orders. In this narrow, dim-lit room, surrounded by enemies and uncertainty, he found the faintest outline of purpose. The war had taken almost everything from him, but it had not taken the one thing that still connected him to who he once was. He could still make broken things speak. Morning in the camp began not with sunlight, but with orders, barked, sharp, unquestionable. Thomas felt them before he heard them, felt the shift in the guards' footsteps as they approached the workshop with a purpose that carried no mercy. When they opened the door, their expressions told him everything. The radio wasn't just another assignment. It was urgent, it was dangerous, and he was the only one who could repair it. One guard jabbed his finger toward the disassembled unit, his voice hard as gravel. "Fix it, quickly." Another guard lifted the barrel of his rifle just enough for the threat to settle into Thomas's bones. The meaning needed no translation. Failure was not part of the arrangement. Thomas swallowed, tasting metal in the back of his throat. He'd been an engineer long before he'd been a prisoner, but captivity had taught him something new. Even familiar tools can feel like shackles when someone else decides what they're used for. The Germans wanted their radio alive again, not for music, not for weather ships, but for war, for hunting, for hearing the sky before it struck them.
His hands trembled as he reached for the first wire, not from cold, but from the weight of knowing he was helping an enemy track the very planes carrying men he once shared rations and laughter with. He imagined them flying blind into danger because of him, the guilt pressed down like another pair of watchful eyes. The workshop itself added to the pressure. Along the walls, propaganda posters peeled at the corners, their colors muted, but their messages sharp. Britain drowning under Luftwaffe fire, cartoonish English soldiers scrambling in fear, threats dressed as triumph. The images felt like they were staring at him, mocking him with the same suspicion the guards held. Still, even as dread tightened around him, something else flickered inside, an instinct he couldn't suppress. The broken radio tugged at him like a wounded creature, helpless and waiting. Its circuits were charred, its dial stiff, its tubes cracked from rough handling. It wasn't a weapon to him, not in this moment. It was a patient on an operating table, and he was the only surgeon in the building. That contrast pulled him forward. Fear pushed him back. Professional pride pushed him onward. The two forces met inside his chest, fighting over each breath. He worked slowly at first, listening to the guards shift behind him, their impatience scraping the air. Then he worked faster, muscle memory overriding fear. The rhythm of screws, wires, and solder felt almost holy, like a quiet ritual from a life that hadn't yet been swallowed by war. For a moment, he wasn't a prisoner. He was simply Thomas Weaver, engineer.
But each time the radio sputtered or hissed, the illusion broke, and he imagined the consequences waiting just behind him. He had no room for error. Tools in his hands, threats at his back, and a war in his conscience, Thomas repaired the machine because he had to, and because broken things still called to him. By late afternoon, the repaired radio sat on the bench like a resurrected relic, humming with a faint, uncertain breath. The guards summoned a pair of German operators, their uniforms crisp despite the mud outside. They entered with the confidence of men who believed technology, discipline, and the Reich itself were all welded into one unbreakable machine. One operator twisted the dial with a flourish, as though expecting applause from the airwaves. Instantly, the room filled with the sharp, triumphant voice of a propaganda announcer. He spoke of victories on every front, of enemies crumbling, of the inevitable dawn Germany was bringing to the world. His tone was smooth, unwavering, polished like marble, so perfect it no longer sounded human. The guards nodded, satisfied. This was the sound they trusted, rehearsed certainty, victory without doubt. But Thomas listened with an engineer's ear. Something was wrong. The signal was too clean for a field unit. The announcer's breath never cracked, even between sentences. The background noise was suspiciously absent, as if the world behind him had been scrubbed away. It wasn't a broadcast, it was a performance, a crafted illusion sent through wires to keep fear at bay. While the operators congratulated themselves, Thomas leaned toward the receiver, adjusting a small dial, just a touch, nothing obvious. A flicker of static cut through the propaganda, like a thin tear in a painted curtain. He nudged the tuning further, letting the polished certainty slip out of alignment. And then he heard it. A faint voice, rougher, unfiltered, drifting from somewhere far to the west. It wasn't shouting about victory or destiny. It wasn't shouting at all. It sounded like a report, real, hurried, imperfect. A man speaking as though the world hadn't paused for him to get the words right. The tone carried wind, urgency, truth. Thomas froze. This wasn't meant for German ears. It wasn't meant for his either. But it was real in a way the propaganda could never be. The contrast was small, almost invisible,
a single honest voice slipping through a fortress of lies. But in a place built on control, even a whisper could feel like an earthquake. The guards snapped back to attention as the static grew louder. One glared at the dial, suspecting interference, jamming, perhaps even allied trickery. Thomas kept his expression blank, masking the sudden spark that warmed his chest. For the first time since his capture, he felt the edge of a truth the camp couldn't contain. Germany broadcast certainty, but the airwaves, when allowed to breathe, told a different story. A story no walls could fully silence. Evening crept into the workshop with the same heaviness as the cold. The guards rotated, the operators left, and for the first time in hours, the room felt almost still. Thomas sat back, rubbing the ache from his wrists, letting the radio's gentle hum settle around him like a thin blanket of normalcy. The door creaked open again. Thomas tensed. Every unexpected sound in the camp carried teeth. But instead of a senior officer or a barking order, a young corporal stepped inside, clutching a chipped metal mug. His boots were too new for a veteran, his face too soft for war. He set the mug beside Thomas without ceremony. "Tea," he said in halting English. "Hot, good for hands." Thomas blinked, unsure whether to accept it, but the corporal didn't wait for thanks. He hovered, eyes flicking toward the radio rather than the prisoner he was supposedly supervising. "You fix all this?" he asked, gesturing at the open panels and scattered tools. Thomas nodded slowly. "That's the idea." The corporal stepped closer, drawn by something quieter than duty. "How do you make sound go so far? How does it travel?" His voice carried genuine curiosity, not the stiff superiority the others wore like armor. Thomas studied him. The corporal, Lucas, his name tag read, couldn't have been more than 18, an age when most boys were still figuring out their futures, not marching in uniforms that didn't quite fit their shoulders. There was a nervousness to him, a hesitation that had nothing to do with fear of Thomas and everything to do with fear of the expectations placed upon him. "It travels because the world is full of waves, invisible ones. You tap into them, guide them, shape them. The air carries more than people think."
Lucas's eyes brightened just slightly. Invisible waves. He rolled the words around as if tasting something new. The silence that followed wasn't tense nor hostile. It was simply human, awkward, uncertain, almost tender. Thomas felt the unfamiliar sensation of a guard who wasn't guarding, just listening. He reached for the tea. Warmth seeped into his palms, surprising him more than the gesture itself. It was the first warm thing handed to him in months. Lucas noticed. "You work better when warm," he muttered, suddenly embarrassed by his own kindness, as though he'd broken some unwritten rule. And maybe he had. Thomas had expected cruelty at every turn, expected the caricature of the Nazi monster he'd been warned about. But this boy was neither monster nor myth, just a young man caught in a machine far larger than he understood. In that brief, fragile moment, the prison walls didn't disappear, but they loosened just enough for one human breath to slip through. Night settled over the camp like a lid, sealing every building in cold and silence. The workshop was one of the few places still lit, its single bulb buzzing faintly above Thomas's head. Lucas had been called away for evening roll, leaving Thomas alone with the radio, an enemy machine that suddenly felt less like a threat and more like a pulse waiting to be touched. Thomas glanced at the door. No shadows moving, no boots scraping, no rifles slung casually in intimidation. For the first time in days, the room held only him and the humming device on the bench. He knew the rules, knew them by heart, carved into him through warnings and the quiet example of what happened to prisoners who broke them. Tuning unauthorized frequencies was strictly forbidden. Listening to Allied broadcasts was worse. But the temptation pulled at him with a force he couldn't explain, part memory, part instinct, part hunger. He turned the dial upward.
Static bloomed instantly, a cold, restless hiss. He eased the knob a fraction. A whistle sliced through the air, thin and eerie. Another adjustment, more static. Then a faint rhythmic pulse, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. Thomas leaned closer, breath tight. Another turn. And suddenly, there it was, the cadence he hadn't heard since the day he'd shipped out from Portsmouth. Soft, hurried, unmistakably British. Not military. Civilian. A woman reading public notices, her voice warm despite the grain of the transmission. Thomas froze. Every muscle locked, as though the simple act of listening had turned his entire body into contraband. For several seconds he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Regulations, threats, the weight of captivity, all of it pressed against him. But the voice pulled harder. He closed his eyes, inching the dial with the delicacy of a surgeon. Each millimeter sharpened the sound, brushing away static like dust from a memory. London accents drifted into the room, muffled but unmistakable. Weather updates, ration reminders, a lost dog announcement. Ordinary life, the kind of life he'd once taken for granted. Emotion surged before he could stop it. His throat tightened and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Against all logic, all fear, all consequences, he let the broadcast wash over him. This was supposed to happen. A Nazi radio wasn't supposed to carry the heartbeat of home. Yet here it was, London folded inside a machine built to serve the Reich. The contrast hit him with dizzying force. This device, meant to track enemy planes and amplify German control, had become a quiet bridge stretching across barbed wire, snow, and war. A fragile bridge, but real enough to make his chest ache. Thomas leaned closer still, as though distance might pull the sound apart. His breath slowed, his heartbeat steadied. For a moment, just a moment, the prison walls weren't a prison, it was a doorway, and the voice slipping through the static was proof that the world outside these fences hadn't forgotten how to speak, or how to reach him. The signal wavered like a candle in wind, fading, returning, then slipping again into grain and static. Thomas leaned so close to the radio his forehead nearly touched the metal casing. Each breath felt delicate, as though the wrong movement might scatter the fragile connection carrying an entire world across the darkness. The broadcast continued, an older woman this time, her tone warm, steady, unpolished. She read small messages from London families to soldiers stationed abroad. Birthdays missed, letters lost, prayers whispered. None of it was dramatic, none of it was meant for headlines. It was the quiet heartbeat of a nation trying to stay human in a world that had forgotten how to speak.
Thomas swallowed hard. He didn't know Andrew Hale, but he recognized the tremor hidden inside the words, the trembling hope of people waiting for men who might never return. The static thinned for a moment, clearing the edges of the voice. Thomas held his breath, afraid to blink. Then the woman continued, her tone softening. Now, one more message, for those still unaccounted for. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a faint warning, a tension he couldn't yet name. The woman drew in a small breath, almost hesitant. This next note is from Eleanor Weaver of London. The world fell out from under him. Every muscle in his body locked, his fingers dug into the wooden edge of the table so hard his knuckles whitened. For a second, the workshop blurred, the walls dissolved, the cold vanished. All that remained was the impossible sound of his mother's name in a German camp that had swallowed every trace of who he once was. The voice continued, gentle and unwavering, as if speaking directly into Thomas's bones. She sends her love to her son, Thomas. She says she believes he is alive somewhere, even if news hasn't come. She wants him to know she hasn't given up hope, not one day. The static cracked softly, but the words held. Thomas's breath collapsed into a trembling exhale. His eyes burned before he even realized they were filling. He bowed his head, gripping the table as though the earth itself had tilted. The radio hummed on, unaware of the miracle it had delivered.
His mother's voice, older than he remembered, frayed at the edges but unmistakably hers, floated through enemy wires, across enemy land, into a building where kindness was scarce and warmth even scarcer. The war had ripped him from home, but a sliver of invisible airwaves had found him anyway. He tried to steady himself, but the emotion surged too fast, too deep. A sound escaped him, half breath, half sob. He pressed a hand against his mouth, terrified the guards outside might hear, but unable to stop the tears streaking silently down his face. The woman's message continued, steady as a heartbeat. She says she prays each night you are being treated kindly, that you are warm, that you are safe. Warm, safe. Two words that felt like fairy tales in this camp. Yet hearing them from her, spoken with the sincerity only a mother could hold, wrapped around him like the first real embrace since the day he was captured. In this moment, the contrast was absolute. The war had built iron fences, armed towers, and rules meant to sever him from everything familiar. But technology, this patched-together machine, had undone it all in a single breath. A Nazi radio, meant for command and control, had become a lifeline threaded straight into his soul. Thomas lowered his head, tears dripping soundlessly onto the workbench. He cried not out of weakness, but relief. The kind of relief that comes when the world, against every rule and every expectation, proves it still remembers you. He wasn't lost, not yet, and someone back home still believed he was alive. Thomas didn't hear the door open. The broadcast held him too tightly, his mother's fading words still echoing in the thin air of the workshop. Only when a sliver of colder air touched the back of his neck did he realize someone was behind him. He spun, wiping his face instinctively. Lucas stood in the doorway. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The young corporal's eyes flicked from Thomas to the radio, where the unmistakable lilt of an English woman still drifted through faint static. Lucas's posture stiffened, not in anger, but in sudden awareness. He knew exactly what the rules said about this. He knew what he was supposed to do. Report it. End it. Punish it. Thomas braced himself, breath caught somewhere between fear and the last remnants of hope. The silence stretched thin, fragile as a glass thread. Then Lucas stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as though approaching something wounded. He reached toward the radio. Thomas tensed, expecting the click of the power switch, the rough yank of the cord, maybe even a shout that would bring the guards running. Instead, Lucas simply rested 2 fingers on the volume knob and turned it down.
Not off, just enough that the words became a whisper beneath the static, a secret still breathing but no longer screaming for attention. The gesture was so small it almost felt invisible, but to Thomas it was everything. Lucas glanced at him, a hesitant question in his eyes. He didn't ask whose voice Thomas had been listening to. He didn't need to. The tears Thomas hadn't fully hidden told their own story. After a long moment, Lucas looked away, pretending to examine the solder wire scattered across the bench. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. You shouldn't listen to Allied broadcasts. It is dangerous." Thomas nodded. "I know." Lucas's hand lingered on the radio as though deciding how much of himself he was willing to risk. Then, barely audible, he added, "But I didn't hear anything." The words fell into the room with the weight of a vow. 2 enemies, alone in a workshop filled with static and shadows, sharing a silence more binding than any conversation. The air felt suspended, almost sacred. For the first time, Thomas sensed something shifting, not just in Lucas, but between them. This young German soldier, raised on slogans and orders, had chosen not to be the army's voice in that moment. He had chosen to be human. And in doing so, he shielded a British prisoner from his own side's wrath. The contrast was stark, almost disorienting. The war demanded division, duty demanded punishment, yet in this dim-lit room, compassion outweighed all of it. When Lucas finally met Thomas's eyes again, something unspoken passed between them. Not friendship, not allegiance, trust. A small, quiet trust born in the narrow space where fear and decency collided and chose decency. The night shattered without warning. A single rising wail split the air, slicing through the stillness of the workshop. Thomas jolted upright as the air raid sirens burst into full cry, long, trembling notes that vibrated through the walls and into the marrow of every man in the camp. The sound meant only one thing: Allied bombers were approaching. Instantly, chaos erupted outside. Boots slammed against frozen ground. Guards shouted conflicting orders, their voices sharp with fear rather than authority. Doors clanged open and shut as prisoners were driven toward shelters that barely deserved the name. Lucas spun toward Thomas, eyes wide. For a moment, he looked like the boy he still was, young, terrified, unprepared for the sky to open. "Under table," he barked in German, then repeated in English louder, "Get down." Thomas hesitated. The instinct to survive clashed with something colder, sharper, an awareness of what was coming and who was coming. His countrymen were in those plains, men who believed they were striking at an enemy, men who believed everyone below was the uniform they wore. Lucas grabbed Thomas's arm and pulled him down, just as the workshop windows rattled from the distant rumble of engines. The ground trembled faintly, like a giant clearing its throat. Then the radio sprang to life. The repaired unit crackled, sputtered, and locked on to a priority channel. A clipped German voice fired out coordinates, altitude estimates, warnings for anti-aircraft crews. It was a beacon of order in the surrounding chaos, calm, efficient, deadly. Thomas stared at it, a sick twist forming in his gut. He had fixed that radio. He had breathed life back into the machine, now warning German soldiers about incoming British aircraft. His aircraft, his people. Every instruction flowing from the speaker was a thread connecting his captivity to the actions of the enemy. A wave of guilt hit him so hard he nearly lost his balance. Had he betrayed his own? Had he sharpened the blade aimed at them? But then he looked at Lucas. Curled beside him on the floor, the young corporal shielded Thomas with his own body, even as the sirens wailed and the walls shook. Lucas's hand trembled, not with aggression, but with the raw fear of someone who'd never asked to be part of a war this big. Thomas's heartbeat slowed, settling into a strange clarity. The question shifted. This wasn't about sides, not in this moment. It was about people ducking under the same wooden table, flinching at the same thunder overhead. About survival shared between two men who by every rule of war should have been enemies.
Thomas glanced again at the radio. Its voice carried certainty, but his hands, those same hands that had once served the Royal Navy, had restored more than a tactical tool. They had given these men a chance to live through the night. What seemed like betrayal became something far more human. Protection, responsibility, a fragile mercy. The sirens wailed on, shaking the workshop with their grief. Thomas closed his eyes, accepting the truth with a quiet, heavy breath. Survival wasn't a uniform, it was a choice. The raid faded the way storms sometimes do, slowly, uncertainly, leaving behind an echo that seemed to cling to the air long after the danger had passed. For several minutes, neither Thomas nor Lucas moved from beneath the workbench. They listened to the diminishing hum of distant engines, to the final groans of anti-aircraft guns winding down, to the uneasy quiet settling over the camp like dust. And then, as if the night itself sighed in relief, silence finally arrived. Lucas rose first, brushing plaster from his hair. His hands shook slightly, the adrenaline not yet spent. Thomas emerged more slowly, muscles stiff from fear and cold. The workshop looked different in the aftermath, dimmer, smaller,
its corners coated in a thin veil of dust shaken loose by the trembling earth. The radio still crackled on the table, broadcasting clipped confirmations that the bombers had passed. No casualties reported in their immediate sector. The voice sounded almost bored, as if acknowledging death without ever meeting its eyes. Lucas reached over and switched it off. For a moment, the sudden stillness felt almost sacred. He turned toward Thomas, his expression softened in a way Thomas had never seen before. There was gratitude there, raw, unguarded, but also something harder to name. A realization, perhaps, that the man standing before him wasn't the enemy propaganda had promised. "Thank you," Lucas said quietly. Thomas frowned. "For what? I didn't do anything." Lucas shook his head. "Not for tonight. For earlier. For understanding." He hesitated, searching for words that didn't yet exist in his language or his experience. "You could have hated me. You had reason." Thomas didn't answer right away. The war had taught both of them what hatred looked like, sounded like, felt like. But tonight, crouched under the same table, they had learned something the war had not prepared them for. Lucas took a slow breath, then reached for his pistol. Thomas stiffened instinctively, but the corporal only unbuckled the holster and placed the weapon gently on the table between them. A deliberate act, a risky act, an act of trust. "I don't want you to fear me, not anymore." Thomas stared at the pistol. The cold metal suddenly transformed into something strange, a symbol not of violence, but of surrender. Not to him, but to the fragile humanity that had survived the night. Moved, he stepped toward the radio instead of the weapon. "The tuning will drift," he said softly. "After a raid, vibrations can throw the alignment off. If you want long-range reception to stay stable, you need to adjust the coil here." Lucas blinked, surprised. "You will teach me?" Thomas nodded. "Knowledge is safer than weapons, and more honest." A faint smile touched the young man's face, exhausted but real. They stood together in the quiet workshop, surrounded by dust, silence, and the lingering memory of falling bombs. Two men still wearing the uniforms their nations demanded, but shaped, in this moment, not by war's cruelty, but survival's strange mercy. The contrast was unmistakable. War taught hatred. Survival taught connection. Years later, long after uniforms had been folded away and victory parades had dissolved into memory, Thomas kept a radio on a narrow wooden shelf in his study. It wasn't the German set he had repaired in that cold workshop. He would never have brought that relic home, but a small British model, metal-framed, slightly dented, its dials worn smooth by years of use. Every evening, almost by ritual, he tuned it to BBC London.
He didn't listen for news anymore. Politics, speeches, arguments, those belonged to the world outside his window. What mattered to him were the human voices that drifted through the static. Laughter, announcements, bits of music escaping from late broadcasts. Sometimes, on evenings when the air felt heavy with memory, he simply let the static fill the room. It sounded, oddly, like winter in Germany. People often asked why he liked radios so much. As an engineer, he could have chosen complex machines or glamorous inventions to admire. But Thomas always smiled and gave the same quiet answer. Radios remind me of who we are when walls fall away. Only he knew what that truly meant. He remembered the workshop, its oil smell, its iron door, the propaganda posters promising that Britain would collapse under the Reich's might. He remembered the trembling moment when he turned a forbidden dial and heard a breath of home seeping through enemy static. And he remembered the voice that followed, warm, determined, achingly familiar. His mother, speaking into a London community microphone, her words drifting unknowingly across a war-torn continent. He had not known whether to laugh or break apart.
In that instant, surrounded by uniforms and suspicion, he felt something outrun the war entirely. Not hope exactly, but a reminder that he belonged to a world beyond barbed wire. The older he grew, the more he realized how impossible that moment had been. Nations could close borders, armies could sever roads, but sound waves? They obeyed no frontiers. They slipped through fences, over frozen fields, past searchlights, into rooms where enemies crouched shoulder to shoulder without meaning to. Weapons divided nations. Sound ignored them. Sometimes people asked whether he ever hated the Germans he'd been forced to work for. Thomas would pause, always thinking first of Lucas, the young corporal with dust in his hair and fear in his eyes, who had lowered the volume instead of raising the alarm. The boy who had seen him not as a prisoner, but a man hearing his mother's voice for the first time in months. How could he hate a whole people when one of them had offered him silence instead of punishment? In letters he occasionally wrote but never sent, Thomas tried to capture what that winter had taught him, that propaganda demanded hatred, but humanity often slipped in through the cracks, that a single act of mercy could rattle the machinery of an empire, that the quietest moments, ones the world never sees, shape a man more than any headline. Late at night, when the house was still, he would turn the radio dial slowly, savoring the soft hiss between stations. Somewhere in that noise lived the memory of a frozen workshop, a forbidden broadcast, and a fragile trust formed in the shadow of falling bombs. The war had been loud, but the moments that saved him had been quiet, and those were the ones he carried for the rest of his life.